The last time we were here, we got about maybe a third of the way through this story of Pinocchio and the transformation of a marionette into something hypothetically real. And I'm going to backtrack a few slides and it'll get us into it again. So you remember that the blue fairy, so I would say the benevolent element of Mother Nature in the schemata that we're going to use to investigate mythology, had more or less been allowed her entrance because Geppetto was a good guy and because he wished for the right thing. And so in some sense, here's a way of thinking about that. You know, genetic/environmental studies of children's temperament have revealed something quite interesting, which is that the shared environment that children have within a family, so that would be what's the same about your environment and your brother's environment, to say, doesn't have that much effect on your temperament or his temperament. Because the presumption always was that within a family there was a shared environment, right? That something was common about the environment to every child within that environment. But there isn't much of a shared environmental effect on temperament. And so then you could say, well, that makes it appear as though parenting isn't that relevant in relationship to the development of temperament. But you could also suggest something else. You could suggest that if parenting is occurring properly, the effect of the shared environment should be very close to zero. And the reason for that is that you establish an individual relationship with each child. And the environment is actually a microenvironment that's composed of your observations of your child and that specific child's interaction with you. And to some degree, if there's a shared environment, that means that you're enforcing the same principles on every child. And so my suspicions are, although I don't know this and the research hasn't been done, that in bad families there's a shared environmental effect, but in good families that minimizes. And so that lets the child's biological predisposition, roughly, manifest itself with support and in some positive manner. Well, I don't want to extend the analogy too far, but you could imagine that and this is what this film proposes, is that if you aim properly in relationship to your child, what you're trying to do is to establish an individual relationship and to allow them to move towards whatever their particular expression of individuality happens to be. And that's, well, that would be the same as allowing nature to take its course in some sense, at least nature in its positive guise, and that's exactly what happens here. Now, the other thing that happens, of course, is that the cricket, for reasons that aren't clear precisely, is knighted by the blue fairy and serves as Pinocchio's conscience, although he isn't very good at it, which is a very peculiar thing and quite a marked point that the film is making, that conscience actually has something to learn too. And there's actually a Freudian element to that, you know, because Freud thought of the superego as the internalization, roughly speaking, of the father. And it could be very severe, the superego, so it could be like a really strict father, really tyrannical father inside your head. Although I think it's better to think about the superego as the internalized representation of society at large, mediated to some degree through your parents, because it's not as if your father, even assuming he's tyrannical, is the inventor of all those tyrannical rules. He's the propagator of them, but he's actually a proxy voice, even if it's just for the harsh side of society. He's a proxy voice for society. And because we're social creatures, the utility of having an internal social voice to guide you, although again you seem to be able to follow it or not follow it, which I also find spectacularly interesting, because obviously if it was an unerring guide you could just follow it, and if it was an unerring guide, well, you wouldn't need free will either, because you could just act out the dictates of this internal representation, and that isn't what you do. So anyways, the proposition here is that the conscience exists, but it's a relatively flawed entity, and it needs to be modified as well by nature, which is quite interesting, because the blue fairy knights him, because you also might think of the conscience as only something that's socially constructed, right, which is the more typical viewpoint. But I don't buy that for a second, because I believe firmly, and I think the Piagetian interpretation of child development more or less bears this out, is that there are parameters within which conscience has to operate, and that it's sort of like this. It's like it's the same parameters that govern fair play, we'll say that. And so you can say there's fair play within a game, and there's fair play across sets of games. And the set of games is pretty much indistinguishable from the actual environment, right? If you think about all the things you do as nested games, at some point the spread of that is large enough so it encompasses everything you do, which includes the environment. And so I believe that you're adapted to the set of all possible games, roughly speaking, all possible playable games, something like that, and that you know the rules for that, which is why we talked about this a little bit, why you're so good at identifying cheaters. You have a module for that according to the evolutionary psychologists, and you not only do you identify them, but you really remember them. It really sticks in your mind. And there's other evidence too. So one piece of evidence that I love, I think it's so, well, there's a couple. One I would derive from Franz de Waal, who's a famous primatologist, and he studied the prototype morality that emerges in chimpanzees. And it's very much nested in their dominance structures, you know, because you could think of morality in some sense as the understanding of the rules by which the dominance hierarchy operates, right? And so you could say, well, the biggest, ugliest, meanest chimp, and the male dominance hierarchies in chimps seem to be the predominant ones, although the females also have a dominance hierarchy in it. It's not quite so clear in bonobos, which seem to be more female dominated. But in any case, the primary chimp dominance structure is male, and you could think, well, it's like the caveman chimp who's biggest and toughest, who necessarily rules and who rules longest. But that isn't what de Waal found. See, the problem with being mean, let's say, and not negotiating your social landscape and not trading reciprocal favors is that no matter how powerful you are as an individual, two individuals, 3/4 of your power can do you in. And that happens with the chimps fairly regularly. If the guy on top is too tyrannical and doesn't make social connections, then weaker chimps, males, make good social connections, and when he's not in such good shape, they take him down, and viciously too. De Waal has documented some unbelievably horrendous acts of, let's call it regicide, among the chimpanzee troops that he studied, mostly in the Arnhem Zoo. They have a big troop there that's been there a long time. But he's very interested in prototypical morality. And here's some other examples of prototypical morality emerging among animals. There's many of them. But one is, you know, if two wolves have a dominance dispute, that would be more likely among the male wolves, but it doesn't really matter. They basically display their size, and they growl ferociously and puff up their hair so they look bigger. And, you know, you can see cats do that when they go into fight or flight, right? Not only do they puff up, including their tail, but they stand sideways, and the reason they do that is because they look bigger, right? Because they're trying to put out the most intimidating possible front. So anyways, if two wolves are going at it, what they're really trying to do is to size each other up, and they're trying to scare each other into backing off, fundamentally. Because, see, the worst case scenario is like you're wolf number 1 and I'm wolf number 2, and we tear each other to shreds, but I win, but I'm so damaged after that wolf number 3 comes in and takes me out. So, like, there's a big cost to be paid even for victory in a dominance dispute if it degenerates into violence. And animals, and human beings, but animals in particular, have evolved very, very specific mechanisms to escalate dominance disputes towards violence step by step, so that the victor doesn't risk incapacitating himself by winning. So what happens with the wolves is that, you know, they growl at each other and posture and display, and maybe they even snap at each other, but the probability that they're going to get into a full-fledged fight is pretty low. And what happens is one of the wolves backs off and flips over and shows his neck, and that basically means, all right, tear it out, you know. And the other wolf says, of course he doesn't, well, you're kind of an idiot and you're not that strong, but we might need you to take down a moose in the future, and so, you know, despite your patheticness, I won't tear out your throat. And then they've established their dominance position, and then from then on, at least for some substantial period of time, the subordinate wolf gives way to the dominant wolf. But at least the subordinate wolf is alive, and, you know, he might be dominant over other wolves. And so everyone in the whole hierarchy has sorted that out either through mock combat or through combat itself. And, you know, the low-ranking members aren't in the best possible position, but at least they're not getting their heads torn off every second of their existence. And so there's even some utility in the stability of the dominance hierarchy for the low-ranking members, because at least they're not getting pounded, they're getting threatened, which is way better. I mean, it's not good, but it's way better than actual combat. And then there's the example of rats, which I love. This is Jaak Panksepp's work, and he wrote a book called Affective Neuroscience, which I would highly, highly recommend. I have a list of readings, recommended readings on my website. It's a brilliant book, and he's a brilliant psychologist, really. One of the top psychologists as far as I'm concerned, both theoretically and experimentally, a real genius. He's the guy who discovered that rats laugh when you tickle them. They laugh ultrasonically, so you can't actually hear them, but if you record it and slow it down, then you can hear them giggling away when you tickle them with an eraser, which is sort of like their mother's tongue. It's often what lab people use as a substitute for the licking of the little rat by the mother. And he discovered the play circuit in mammals, which is like a major deal, right? He should get a Nobel Prize for that. That's a big deal, to discover an entire motivational circuit whose existence no one had really predicted, you know, apart from the fact that obviously mammals play. And even lizards, maybe. Some of the more social lizards seem to play, you know. So anyhow, what Panksepp observed, and I think this is a brilliant piece of science, is that, first of all, juvenile male rats in particular like to rough and tumble play. They like to wrestle, and they actually pin each other just like little kids do, or like adult wrestlers do. They pin their shoulders down, and that basically means you win. And so, okay, so that's pretty cool. But what's even cooler, I think, well, there's three things. One is the rats will work for an opportunity to get into an arena where they know that play might occur. And so that's one of the scientific ways of testing an animal's motivation, right? So imagine you have a starving rat and it knows that it's got food down the end of a corridor. You can put a little spring on its tail and measure how hard it pulls, and that gives you an indication of its motivational force. Now imagine the starving rat that's trying to get to some food, and you have a little spring on his tail, and you waft in some cat odor. So now that rat is starving and wants to get out of there. He's going to try to pull even farther towards the food. So getting away plus getting forward are separate motivational systems, and if you can add them together, it's real potent. And part of the reason why in the future authoring exercise that you guys are going to do as the class progresses, you're asked to outline the place you'd like to end up, which is your desired future, and also the place that you could end up if you let everything fall apart, is so that your anxiety chases you and your approach systems pull you forward. You're maximally motivated then. And it's important because otherwise you can be afraid of pursuing the things that you want to pursue, right? And that's very common. And so then the fear inhibits you as the promise pulls you forward, but it makes you weak because you're afraid. You want to get your fear behind you, pushing you. And so what you want to be is more afraid of not pursuing your goals than you are of pursuing them. It's very, very helpful. And lots of times in life, and this is something really worth knowing, you know, and this is one of the advantages to being an autonomous adult, is you don't get to pick the best thing. You get to pick your poison. You have two bad choices, and you get to pick which one you're willing to suffer through. And every choice has a bit of that element in it. And so if you know that, it's really freeing, because otherwise you torture yourself by thinking, well, maybe there's a good solution to this, you know, compared to the bad solution. It's like, no, sometimes there's just risky solution 1 and risky solution 2. And sometimes both of them are really bad, but you at least get to pick which one you're willing to suffer through. And that actually makes quite a bit of difference, because you're also facing it voluntarily then, instead of it chasing you. And that is an entirely different psychophysiological response. Challenge versus threat, it's not the same, even if the magnitude of the problem is the same. And so putting yourself in a challenging, let's call it mind frame, you can't just do that by magic. Putting yourself in a challenging mind frame is much easier on you psychophysiologically, because you don't go into the generalized stress response to the same degree. And you're activating your exploratory and seeking systems, which are dopaminergically mediated and that involve positive emotion. So if you can face something voluntarily rather than having it chase you, it's way better for you psychophysiologically. So that's partly why, well, it's worthwhile to go find the dragon in its lair instead of waiting for it to come and eat you. So, and especially when you also add the idea that if you go find the dragon in its lair, you might find it when it's a baby instead of a full-fledged bloody monster that is definitely going to take you down. And so that's part of the reason why, well, there's a whole bunch of things that emerge out of that observation, like don't avoid small problems that you know are there. Face them, because they'll grow into big problems all by themselves. And you can think about, imagine the tax department sends you a notification. You owe them like $300. Well, it's, you know, that's annoying. Maybe you don't even want to open the letter. Or maybe if you do, you just put it on the shelf.